Well, I always seem to start off my episodes with this statement. It's been a while. And today is no exception. It is certainly no exception because it's been a while. It's been about, it's been about a year and a half since I recorded my last podcast episode, I think. But anyway, I hope you all are doing well. This is Christian Bassar speaking again with another episode of the Historical Thoughts and Interpretations podcast. And today what I'm going to be looking at is the fall of Mamluk Egypt in the early 16th century. And actually, this is actually based on a paper that I wrote a few years ago. So you can have a look at it. It's just a short little paper if you prefer to read it instead of listen to it. It's academia.edu, and so that's the site where that's hosting this paper. Academia.edu, for those who don't know, it's a very good site. It's almost like a social network, or if you're doing scholarly work, like if you're in history or sociology, whatever, you can upload papers and you can connect with each other and everything like that. So I've uploaded a few papers there, and this one is also there. So you'll see, if you look up my name on academia.edu, and then if you look up Christian Bassar, Basar, you will see my work there. So this paper is entitled Corrupt and Obsolete, an Analysis of the Fall of Mamluk Egypt. So I just thought I'd do this as a podcast version of it. Cliched term, but let's jump right into it. You know, the roots of the Mamluk Empire in Egypt started during the Muslim Ayyubid dynasty, and Mamluks were originally slaves with Turkish origins, and they were brought into the army. But many of these slaves eventually became military commanders, and they were given ikta, or tax farms, which gradually made them into the state military recruiters and part of the aristocracy. So it was literally kind of a slaves to rulers, basically. And in the mid-13th century, the Mamluks killed the Ayyubid Sultan and took control of Egypt. And the Mamluks soon took over territory in Palestine and Syria, so they moved into parts of the rest of the Middle East. And so they were able to do this, and also, not only that, they were able to conquer these territories, but also repelled invasions by the Mongols and the Crusaders. And they were very skilled in horse archery and swordsmanship. So the Mongols have gotten a very, they're widely known for having incredible skill in using horse archers in their combat. And the Mamluks did the same thing. But the Mamluk Empire could not survive its war with the Ottomans in 1516 to 1517. So, yeah, they may have defeated the Mongols and the Crusaders a few hundred years earlier, but when the Ottomans came, it was a different story. And there were two reasons for this defeat, which we'll go over in this podcast. At first, by the time of the Ottoman War, again, 1516, the Mamluk military class had sort of lost its way. It had become a class of rich, corrupt, and undisciplined oppressors. And secondly, the Mamluks shunned firearms, which were around by the time, but refusing to adopt them on a wide scale, left the Mamluk army obsolete and at the mercy of the modern Ottoman Empire's military. Because remember that a few decades before that, the Ottomans took down Constantinople, the capital of the old Byzantine Empire. And they had huge cannons that had to be pulled by, that were absolutely huge, right? I forget exactly the size, but they had to be pulled by huge teams carrying them, right? So this shows that the Ottomans had that capability to bring modern weapons to the front. So the Mamluks weren't willing to do that. So in the end, corruption weakened the Mamluks, and the lack of good weapons prevented them from protecting themselves effectively. In the early days of Mamluk rule, the Ottoman Turks formed a defensive buffer between Egypt and Europe. But the Mamluk-Ottoman relationship turned hostile in the late 14th century after Syrian rulers raided Turkish territory. The consequent tension culminated in two wars a century later, in the 15th century, in which the Mamluks were victorious and a peace was established afterwards. But relations soon soured again after 1513. And this was when the Ottomans, under Selim Shah ibn Othman, fought a war against Shah Ismail al-Sufi, and he was known as the leader of the two Iraqs. Othman had feared the possibility of problems with his Shia subjects who supported al-Sufi. And al-Sufi decided to champion their cause by warring with the Ottomans, but he was soundly defeated. And this allowed Othman to attack other areas, including Dogadir and Mesopotamia. And so this conflict between the Ottomans and Shah Ismail al-Sufi, it brought the Ottomans towards war with Egypt. In 1516, the Mamluk Sultan, Kansu al-Guri, decided to move an army to Aleppo, which is, of course, in modern-day Syria, and he just decided to observe the war between Othman and al-Sufi. He believed that whoever won that war would then invade Egypt, though Othman insisted that his quarrel was only with al-Sufi. Muhammad ibn Iyas, a contemporary writer, he said, quote, "Nothing could deter Othman from wiping off Ismail Shah from the face of the earth. But the Ottoman ruler had no intention of fighting the Mamluks." Ibn Iyas believed that this was a deception. For while Othman sent al-Ghuri diplomatic gifts, he was supposedly plotting to invade Egypt at the same time. There were a number of reasons why Othman might want to backstab the Mamluks, so to speak. For example, a disloyal brother of his was living in Egypt at that time. Local rulers who could supply the Ottoman military were dependent on the Mamluks, and aside from the diplomatic gifts, there was little positive contacts between the two powers. So, yeah, diplomatic gifts, but everything else, well, who cares about those gifts, right? Ibn Iyas wrote that Othman broke the peace by capturing multiple fortresses, leading to a battle at Merj Dabek. Here the Mamluks killed many enemy soldiers, but they lost the battle, and the Sultan al-Ghuri died, leaving the Mamluks without a sultan, and Arab raiders took the opportunity to pillage Mamluk territory. Tuman Bai, who had ruled effectively while al-Ghuri was on campaign, he was declared the new sultan. The Mamluks suffered a major loss, though, at al-Shariat. They suffered a third and final defeat in January 1517 at the Battle of, and I'm sorry, I don't speak Arabic, so I might butcher this pronunciation, but at the Battle of Raidiniya, after which the Turks advanced into Cairo and took control of Egypt. So the Mamluk Empire was officially taken over in January 1517. So the fall of the Mamluks had a long origin and multiple contributing factors. One of the most obvious factors was the quote-unquote corruption of their class. They had retained the Ubaid practice of the Iqta tax farm system, which I mentioned before. And under the Iqta system, they taxed the peasantry, or which were also known as the Falahin. And Iqta holders abused the peasants by relentlessly taxing them and even forbidding them from leaving their farms without permission. Which is kind of interesting. In Russian history, you see the same thing. They instead of you could call them serfs or peasants, right? And they weren't allowed to leave except on certain days, at certain holidays. And so, going back to Mamluk Egypt, Ibn Iyas, the writer, noted multiple cases of abuse, even during the Ottoman War. He spoke of a man named Janem al-Ifraniye, a quote-unquote rapacious imported Mamluk who looted and harassed people while on campaign. In another instance, coercion was used to raise funds for road and wall construction, but this was actually a scam. So this was an example of public works being used for corruption, for personal enrichment. Ibn Iyas praised Tuman Bai for carrying out justice in such cases, but this kind of Mamluk oppression was common. So even though Tuman Bai stood up to this, it still happened. It was an endemic problem in the Mamluk system. Eventually, the Mamluks saw their Iqtas as hereditary entitlements, and so corruption was increased among this landed class, causing a decline in agricultural production and the stagnation of public works. Worse, the Mamluks began to leave military service, which had consequences for the economy. So the Sultan was now forced to rely on other sources of fighting men, and he had to tax trade in order to maintain the army. So when the Mamluks are sitting on their Iqtas and they're just gaining personal wealth and just taxing the Felahin under them, and they see, well, why do I need to join the military? I have a comfortable life here, right? Just kind of going into their point of view. And so now there's less money going into public works, and the Sultan has to bring in other men, and he has to raise taxes. So such taxation impoverished Syria, and it affected Egypt's trade with the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean markets. So, this is a kind of a relevant thing right now because Canada and the United States and Mexico seem to be, the future of NAFTA, and it depends on many, the North American Free Trade Agreement. The future of that agreement is in trouble. So, but now there could be a question of, I'm certainly not an economist, but the idea of wanting to trade with another country because it's possibly a good market, if that incoming trade is going to be taxed, if I'm going to lose some of my profits sending my commodities to this country, well, why would I want to trade with them? I'm certainly going to lose interest, right? So this is sort of what happened in the Mamluk case. And so this decline in trade, it strained the treasury of the Mamluk Empire, and it caused great problems for Tumenbai when his troops demanded money during the Ottoman War. In deserting their military obligations, the Mamluks also lost their combat effectiveness and military spirit. As an indication of this problem, David Ayalon wrote about the decline of the Mamluks' military training from 1382 until the Ottoman conquest of the early 1500s. And the traditional exercises, he argues, known as furusia, taught the Mamluks to fight on horses with swords, lances, and bows. But during the 14th and 15th centuries, various hippodromes, the hippodrome was a term used for an area that was used for cavalry training, and hippodromes became unusable due to the River Nile flooding, political tension, and neglect. They just fell apart. In general, military training greatly declined, so by Al-Ghuri's time, Mamluk combat techniques were sloppy or simply even forgotten. Al-Ghuri tried to revive this Furusia training, but this was not enough to save the Mamluks from defeat. Alongside poor training, some Mamluks displayed poor battlefield discipline during the Ottoman War. At the Battle of Merjdabek, some of the Mamluks deserted Al-Ghuri after the battle was lost. Ibn Iyas wrote about these Mamluks. He really berates them. He says the Mamluks, in his view, displayed, quote, no feats of horsemanship, and they were useless in combat as blocks of wood. So he's really getting poetic about this, but he's saying, these guys were stupid, they weren't fighting, they were not using their horse, they seem to not know how to ride a horse, and they were, a block of wood would be just as effective as them in combat. So these exaggerated negative descriptions could have been written due to the frustration of defeat, but Ibn Iyas's words certainly fit the narrative in which the Mamluks lost their military ethic. And before the final battle of Redinia, Sultan Tumenbai proclaimed that all royal Mamluks should stay at their camp overnight because there was a problem with them leaving to go home. So he said, stay at the camp. He has to remind them. It's, if you have an army that's dedicated to fighting and defending the empire or state or nation or whatever, you shouldn't have to remind them, stay in your camp, right? There was at least one brave Mamluk in the Ottoman War. I'm sure there was more, but Ibn Iyas described one in particular. His name was Sudun ibn Janibeh. And this Mamluk, he was of high rank, and in battle he, quote, showed great courage in action and splendid feats of horsemanship, end quote. But others caused trouble before the Battle of al-Shariat by refusing to march out to battle unless they were paid almost 4 times their current wage. Yet the treasury was empty, so this created a loyalty crisis, and the Mamluks threatened to leave Sultan Tumenbai over this. Though they had not been provided with horses, clothes, or weapons, these Mamluks' wage demands were impossible to accommodate. And this crisis was averted only after Tumenbai commanded the sale of many items and even offered to step down in favor of the late Al-Ghuri's son. Lack of discipline and commitment is fatal to any army. When soldiers are unmotivated and put their needs above those of the state they are supposed to protect, the state is vulnerable. Remember, going back to, you shouldn't have to remind soldiers to stay where they're supposed to be. When the Mamluk military class became rich through their Ikta taxes, they had little reason to serve in the army, and the Mamluk army's obsolete tactics and weaponry only compounded this problem. Going back to David Ayalon, he noted that the Mamluks refused to use artillery in the open battlefield, and they reserved them mostly for siege warfare. there were very real tactical considerations. Cannons were essentially upgraded versions of siege engines like trebuchets and catapults, which had been used during the medieval times. And also, battlefields with moving armies and quickly changing conditions would make cannons less usable than in sieges, where stationary walls were vulnerable targets. Yet the Europeans, they were starting to use artillery in battlefields as well, with moving armies and everything, after the Battle of Crécy. And so, with the Mamluks refusing to use cannons in an open battlefield without a siege situation, they're really setting themselves behind. And Sultan Al-Ghuri appears to have attempted to change this, for he, quote, started using cannon at a rate on a scale never before known in the Mamluk kingdom. But none, or at least very few, of these were deployed at the Battle of Merj-Dabek, where they would have been badly needed. This was because the cannons were primarily used to protect coastal... In addition to being used in siege warfare, cannons were also used to protect coastal positions in the Mediterranean and Red Seas, as both the Ottomans and the Portuguese posed threats in these waters. Tumanbai also deployed them defensively at the Battle of Rodinia after scrambling to bring them from Cairo and other places. So they were used at the last battle, but it was a panic to get them there. Rodinia was expected to be a prolonged affair, and Tumanbai fortified his camp with cannons along a stretch, lines of shields, and wooden defenses. Yet the cannons were outflanked and captured from the rear, and the Mamluks lost within hours of the battle's start. Despite their efforts to deploy cannons en masse, the Sultans Al-Ghuri and Tumanbai could not revolutionize Mamluk tactics in time. Handheld firearms were also not introduced in large enough a scale to change Mamluk fighting techniques. In his account, Ibn Iyas mentioned that the Mamluks were manufacturing muskets, and at one instance they deployed about 30 or more oxen-pulled carts carrying gunmen. So the Mamluks certainly did have muskets available, but aside from a few shots fired at the Battle of Rodinia and some desultory engagements, quote, there was little evidence available on the use of Mamluk guns in the war with the Ottomans. It just certainly, it seemed to be a rare thing. They just weren't using them in enough of a capacity to really change what the end result was. So the Mamluks stubbornly stuck to their traditional sword and bow fighting, and this prevented the mass deployment of firearms. Earlier, we saw how Al-Ghuri revived training in the Furusiyya. This was actually a path of least resistance, so to speak, for Mamluk culture was so accustomed to this kind of warfare that any significant deployment of guns would require a massive reorganization and adjustment of military thinking. So they got stuck in the old ways. And the development of new weaponry always requires changes in any army, but Mamluk culture blocked such an initiative, making it much harder to adapt to the new battlefield conditions. Cannons didn't pose such a cultural danger because they came earlier than handheld firearms, and this allowed soldiers to get kind of used to them, culturally accustomed to them, if you will. But cavalry and the bow were part of Mamluk identity. It was part of their culture, and replacing these status symbols with guns would have been a grave dishonor. David Ayalon suggested that even if Al-Ghuri did not revive Furusiyya, the cultural contempt of firearms would make their adoption impossible without a rebuilding of Mamluk society. And it's quite ironic, actually, that even if the Mamluk class had lost their fighting spirit as previously suggested, they conservatively kept their traditional fighting methods to their own peril. It is worth noting that Al-Ghuri further endangered Egypt when he greatly publicized Furusiyya's revival by showing combat exercises to foreign dignitaries. So one of the Ottoman Sultan's diplomats even appeared regularly at these displays. So through these exercises, the Ottomans could see that the Mamluks had concentrating on trying to improve obsolete tactics, and were thus militarily unprepared. By the time of the Ottoman War, it was too late. And so throughout history, many states have fallen due to internal military and social weaknesses, and the Mamluk Empire of Egypt was a prime example of this. In becoming comfortable with their statuses as wealthy landlords, the Mamluks forsook their traditional military service duties, and this affected the army's manpower, discipline, and overall effectiveness. The Mamluks' refusal to implement firearms into their tactics en masse was another nail in the coffin. To summarize, in failing to deal with corruption and adapt to changing military conditions, the Mamluks fell to the modern Ottomans, who turned Egypt into a subservient province. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast there. So, Yeah, I've thought I'd do some more of the a podcast based on the papers I've put on academia. So yeah, so I have a few projects coming down the pipe, so to speak. So keep a listen. Please subscribe to the podcast, and thank you very much, and have a good one.